Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, things are certainly happening, or they seem to be happening in the Watts case, don't they? As far as I'm concerned, it's much ado about nothing because I don't think there's even going to be an appeal. I don't think Watts' attempt to lodge a 35C is going to succeed. So the whole thing about blaming Shanann, I don't even think is going to see the light of day. So the whole brouhaha about that seems to me to be a little bit overblown. But anyway, in this episode we're going to do something that is just hypothetical. We're going to ask the question, what if? What if, for whatever reason, Chris Watts just changed his mind on Sunday night and he just didn't commit the crime? How could things have played out? And you might think that there's a simple answer to that question. I think it's quite an interesting question given where we are right now, where we are 2 years later. So, if you take the circumstances, the affair, the debt, the third pregnancy, the fact that they weren't really happily married, right? And then you look at the circumstances that followed, that the extreme likelihood that Chris Watts would have lost his job, probably Kissinger as well. Recently, the oil industry has laid off 100,000 people in the oil and gas industry, and kind of a high proportion of those in the fracking industry, which requires the margins are lower in terms of profitability compared to other sectors in the oil and gas industry. So if the crime didn't happen when it did, if Watts had just lost his nerve, just thought, look, I'm not that kind of person, I'm not going to do it, I think it is very likely that he would have lost his job. But let's just play it kind of step by step. So if you take it that he didn't commit the crime and they did decide to go to Aspen and they stayed together, and perhaps Watt said to Kissinger, look, sorry, I really love you and I really wanted to work out, but I just can't do this, right? Probably it wouldn't have taken very long. It would have taken some time for them to downsize. They would have moved into a smaller house, and then he would have lost his job this year. And that is if Shanann didn't find out about the affair, then it's possible Kissinger may have lost her job even earlier. But all things being equal, let's just imagine that wasn't the case. I think if they had stayed together, now the baby may have been, say, 1 year old, Watts would have then lost his job, and then I don't see why Shanann would have stayed with him. I think there's quite a good chance that she would have divorced him, simply because someone actually said quite rightly that Shanann wasn't actually in love with Chris right at the end. She needed him, which is different. I agree and I don't agree. I agree in the sense that she did need him in terms of financially, but I don't necessarily in a situation with someone. You're not in love with them. You may even have feelings of intense dislike and unhappiness, but you say, look, let's work on this. And it may be for continuity's sake, it may be just to keep things together. There might be other priorities. But I do think it turns the whole thing around quite an interesting way. If you imagine it playing out, that they downsize, Chris Watts then loses his job, right? Kissinger also loses her job, and Shanann may then have divorced Watts. It's in terms of it wouldn't have made a difference whether she had 3 children and they weren't happily married, and he didn't have a job, or that he left her. I mean, it would be the same thing. She would still need kind of someone to help her look after the children. So what I do think would have been likely then is Shanann may well have moved back to North Carolina, moved in with her parents. Another possibility is that she would have moved everyone to where she was staying and kind of, had kind of like a house share thing going on, which had been going on before anyway. In this situation, you could have had a situation where Watts has now basically been dumped by his wife, and he then is free to engage with Nicole Kessinger. They've now both lost their jobs, and they kind of, let's say, losers, but they losers together. And Watts, how can Watts be expected to pay maintenance or alimony when he doesn't have an income, right? So that whole thing is kind of falls out of the equation. And so in that situation, you may have had a situation where Watts and Kessinger end up together, and maybe they go off somewhere in search of jobs elsewhere. I just think it's kind of an interesting thing. I think another part of this saga, this hypothetical saga, is what would Shanann have done for a living going forward? Would she have continued with MLM? I think the answer is yes. I think she would have continued with it. But I do think there are statistics where they show that most MLMers, something like 90%, if not higher, fall out after 2 years. Like some people stick it out for 1 year, but almost nobody sticks it out for longer than 2 years. And I don't know whether Shanann would have been able to stick it out for longer than that. I just think with eventually everything caving in around her, I just don't know what she would have been able to do. So what do you guys think? Do you agree or do you disagree with that assessment? One thing that is certain is that whatever happened, if Watts didn't go to prison, he would have lost his job this year, probably quite early on in this year as well, like in the first 3 or 4 months of this year. And then you've got to wonder what would have happened after that, after he lost his job. If he was still married to Shanann, I can't see how they wouldn't both have moved back to North Carolina. I think the only way he wouldn't have moved back to North Carolina is if he was still attached to Kessinger. Maybe he could have said to Shanann, why don't you take the kids back to North Carolina, see if you can find work there. I will look around here. And who knows, maybe he would have then continued the affair. Who knows? Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. For those interested, there is TCRS merch available at Teespring. I'll put a link in the description. Also, my 12th and final book on the Watts case is coming out on Tuesday. It's called Silver Fox Post-Truth. The audiobook is available on Patreon on the $10 tier. It's a little bit cheaper than buying the book, and narrated by me. So you can head to Patreon/TCRS to start, listening to the book so long if you'd like to get the book now. I'm also considering putting up an excerpt of the book maybe sometime next week. The book is available on Kindle on Tuesday the 15th, so look out for that. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.